and welcome. You're watching Gravitas with me, Molly Gambhir. Here's a look at what's lined up for you on the show tonight. If you live in India or Pakistan or Afghanistan, last night must have been quite a scary one, to say the least. We were right here in the newsroom when the earthquake struck. The 6.5 magnitude earthquake hit Afghanistan. Tremors were felt as far as New Delhi. Tonight on Gravitas, we get you the bigger picture. We tell you about the warnings that have been issued for the Himalayan region. Is a great Himalayan earthquake right around the corner? How prone are the Himalayas really to earthquakes? How much is the Indian plate shifting each year? Also on the show for you tonight, Pakistan's hope to emerge from its unprecedented economic crisis continues to fade as its friend Saudi Arabia now refuses to give an interest-free loan to the country. We tell you why. A deadly Ebola-like virus is on the prowl in Tanzania. Kenya is on high alert. We tell you why there is growing concern over the spread of this virus. We focus on what's happening in Somalia. As the famine gets worse, the country witnesses suffering because of the drought, and the world seems to look the other way. The New Zealand government wants to give support to those who are going through a breakup. We tell you all about this plan and what triggered it. The 6.5 magnitude earthquake that tore across 3 frontiers on the evening of Tuesday hit around 10:17 p.m. Indian time, 9:47 p.m. Pakistan time, 9:17 p.m. Afghanistan time. The casualties are still being counted, but it resurrected a dread that lies just below the surface of the north of the Indian subcontinent. When will the long-predicted big earthquake hit populous cities like Delhi, Lahore and Rawalpindi? The epicenter this time was in Afghanistan, near the town of Jurm, some 400 kilometers from Kabul. The tremors were felt in Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan and India. And here in India's national capital region, people ran out of the trembling buildings. Soon videos surfaced on social media of people recalling the moment of horror, of fans shaking, chandeliers swinging. Some of these visuals are bone-chilling. And this video from Kashmir's Anantnag went viral, where doctors are seen delivering a baby as the earthquake shakes the operation theatre.
तो बेबी को ठीक रखना, बेबी के बाद Ay, boy, yung kita pagal. La ilaha illallah, la ilaha.
And in Pakistan, the situation was much worse given its proximity to the epicenter. Some 9 people are believed to have died in the Swat Valley alone. A 10-year-old girl died when the wall of her house fell on her. Some 100 others were rushed to hospitals in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Local reports say at least 20 houses have been damaged in this region. Elsewhere in Pakistan as well, there were reports of injuries. The visuals on your screen are from Islamabad. And what was the impact of the earthquake on Afghanistan? It may be too early to answer that question, for the very reason that those in positions of power in Afghanistan do not have much control or idea about what's really happening in the remote parts of the country. And no points for guessing, I'm talking about the Taliban. Initial reports say as many as 50 people have lost their lives in Afghanistan. A Taliban official, in fact, took to Twitter last night to say that at least 20 injured people were brought into hospitals across the country following the earthquake. But I'll tell you what, you should not be surprised if these numbers go up multifold. The visuals from Turkey and Syria were too fresh in our minds when the earthquake struck last night. The tremors definitely came with a déjà vu. But more importantly, they brought along a harsh reminder of the imminence of a great Himalayan earthquake. And also this question, are we now inching closer to that dreaded earthquake? The Great Himalayan Quake is something that has been a part of the discourse for a while now. Seismologists, in fact, believe it is only a matter of time before an earthquake of 8 magnitude or more strikes the Himalayan region. This region, home to the mighty Himalayas, the world's highest mountain range that spreads its wings along India, Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, Pakistan. What makes this beautiful region prone to earthquakes? To answer that, we will have to revisit high school geography and look at why earthquakes occur in the first place. You see, earthquakes happen when a tectonic plate fractures or breaks. And why does that happen? Because of tension. And there is tension building up along the Himalayas. Why is that? Because the Indian plate is shifting 5 centimeters every year, risking the lives of the billions who live in this region in houses that are not built to be earthquake resistant. There were multiple mild earthquakes in this region this morning, one in Tajikistan, one in India's Himachal Pradesh, also an earthquake in Afghanistan. Between the 18th of March and now, there have been at least 43 medium and mild earthquakes in this region. I repeat, 43 earthquakes in 4 days. And many of these earthquakes have been in India. And I'm not making this up. I'm simply telling you what's in the database of the National Center for Seismology. The question now is whether these repeated earthquakes are setting the ground for a major Himalayan earthquake. And if so, what does it mean for those living in this part of the world? I don't know if you know this, but 59% of India's landmass is prone to earthquakes. This is according to the National Center for Seismology. 11 cities and several Indian states and union territories fall within Zone 5, that's the highest risk zone. And which are these states and union territories? Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Gujarat, Bihar, Manipur, Assam, Nagaland, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Bihar. In fact, India's capital, New Delhi, is located near 3 active fault lines. Gurugram, around 7 active fault lines, which makes it the riskiest city in the National Capital Region. And earlier this evening, parts of the NCR were hit by another earthquake. This one was 2.7 magnitude on the Richter scale. But there is no guarantee that the next earthquake will be as mild. So the immediate question is, what do you do? If you live in the Himalayan region, how should you be preparing for the Great Himalayan earthquake? See, if your building has earthquake-resistant construction, if it doesn't, you may want to upgrade. Be ready for an emergency. In many parts of the world, every household has a grab and run bag, with the essentials like dry food, few pairs of clothing, essential medicines, a torch, few batteries, some bottles of water, so that when the tremors strike and your nightmares come true, then you have enough to sustain yourself before help can reach you. And if there is something that we have learned from Turkey and Syria, it is that the world is not the most prompt when it comes to disaster relief. So it's always better to be prepared than be sorry. And here's something else that you should do. Ask your housing society and your office to conduct mock drills so that you and everyone around you is familiar with the basic protocols that will help in appropriately responding to an earthquake. It will limit panic and hopefully also help save lives. And now let me ask you some questions. Do you know which was the first country the Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif visited after coming to power? It was Saudi Arabia. Do you know which is the first country every Pakistani Prime Minister visits after being elected? Again, it's Saudi Arabia. This is a short summary of the close ties between these two countries. Ties that are rooted in history, faith, security, economics. You see, for the longest time, this relationship was immune to changes in leadership. It was immune to domestic and geopolitical compulsions. But that does not seem to be the case anymore. Have a look at this headline. The Middle East Eye carried it. It says Saudi Arabia is no longer willing to bail out Islamabad. It has refused to provide any more interest-free loans to the country. And the question is, why? The answer is Pakistan itself. Its failure to mend its ways, its financial negligence, its political ignorance, its diplomatic ineptitude. Whatever be the case, this development is striking. It has left Pakistan in shock because for the longest time, in fact throughout Pakistan's existence, Riyadh has always been there for the country. On multiple occasions, it has stepped up to bail Islamabad out of its financial mess. It has provided zero-interest loans without any questions asked. In fact, just a mere phone call by the Pakistani Prime Minister or a state visit by Pakistan's army chief were enough to secure the funding. But things are not the same anymore. Pakistan's inability to pay its loans, its inability to get the debt down, its inability to fix its economy has irked the kingdom. So what does it do? It shuts the money taps and scraps the avenue of a bailout. I have a statement with me. It's from Mohammed Al-Jadaan. He is the finance minister of Saudi Arabia. He says, and I'm quoting, "We used to give direct grants and deposits without strings attached, and we are changing that. We are working with multilateral institutions to actually say we need to see reforms. We are taxing our people. We are expecting also others to do the same, to do their efforts. We want to help, but we want you also to do your part. And this is embarrassing to say the least. Pakistan is in dire need of money. The IMF is not willing to help. China says it has done enough. And now you have Saudi Arabia, Pakistan's so-called Islamic brother, refusing to extend a helping hand anymore. You see, this sets a new precedent. Previously, state visits by Pakistani leaders or by the country's army chiefs have been a source of assurance. They usually end up with Riyadh giving Islamabad bags full of money, but not anymore. And with this decision, the Saudis seem to be telling Pakistan that they have had enough of the civilian authorities squandering away handouts. This is a major shift. You see, for decades, the kingdom's #1 partner in South Asia was Pakistan. They exchanged troops, they traded weapons. It was a broad military cooperation. And it continued as recently as 2017. You see, Pakistan's then army chief, Raheel Sharif, was appointed to lead an Islamic anti-terror coalition. This group had 39 nations and was headquartered in Saudi Arabia. And then in 2019, Crown Prince bin Salman offered his private jet to former Prime Minister Imran Khan. He said his guest cannot leave on a commercial flight. Imran Khan was headed to New York for the UN General Assembly. You may remember his hysterical performance there. Turns out, even bin Salman was not impressed. And while returning from the UN, the Crown Prince ordered his plane back to New York. Imran Khan ended up flying commercial after all. And things went downhill from there. In 2020, Pakistan's then foreign minister threatened that they would quit the OIC if Saudi Arabia does not convene a meeting on Kashmir. And the kingdom responded by asking Islamabad to return $2 billion from a loan that it had granted. Pakistan had to borrow money from China to repay the Saudis. And that's not even all. Riyadh further recognized India's right to make decisions on Kashmir and joined New Delhi in condemning global terrorism. The new Saudi Arabia was looking for reliable and trustworthy partners that led them from Pakistan to India. In 2020, a new government came to power, but the ties remained tense, mostly because of Pakistan's financial woes. It kept asking for money, it kept making requests for loans. It assumed that the Saudis would comply. And guess what? Not anymore. That is Riyadh's message, a message that Pakistan may find a bit hard to comprehend. And let's now talk about the war in Ukraine. So far, the focus this week was on all that's happening in Moscow. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping was in the city, meeting and greeting the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two held multiple rounds of talks. They held a joint press conference, issued a joint statement. The world watched their bonhomie in the backdrop of the Ukraine war. But Xi Jinping has now left Moscow, and with him, the spotlight also has moved away from the city. You see, all eyes are now on Japan, which will soon be hosting a summit of the G7 leaders. And will this summit be the platform that provides an alternative position on the war? After all, Moscow was all about Xi-Putin bonhomie. Will the G7 be all about Putin bashing?
The world was astonished to see innocent civilians in Bucha killed 1 year ago. As I step on the ground of Bucha today, I really feel great anger for all the atrocious acts.
Many were taken by surprise when the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida decided to travel to Ukraine earlier this week. One moment he was holding talks with his Indian counterpart, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the next moment Kishida is on a flight followed by a train to Kiev. Was the trip as impromptu as Japan would have you believe? Or was it pre-planned after all? If so, why did Kishida decide to go via India? Are there some dots we are supposed to connect here? You know, India and Japan are Quad partners. Japan is this year's G7 president, and India is the sitting president of the Group of 20. So when the leaders of these two countries, India and Japan, met in New Delhi earlier this week, did they happen to discuss Ukraine and what it means for the G7 and G20, and how the two groupings can try to have solution-oriented discussions during the upcoming summits? Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be attending the G7 summit this year. So will Australia, the other Quad partner, also Vietnam and Indonesia, countries that have territorial disputes with China. My point is, while Xi and Putin were grabbing headlines in Moscow, was there a strategic play in New Delhi that most headlines failed to pick? Because what else explains Kishida's interestingly timed visit to Kiev following his state visit to India? What explains the Delhi factor? Is it a coincidence, or is there more to this? Because a few months from now, when Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK and the US meet for the G7 summit, the club of Western allies will be looking for an opportunity to bash Vladimir Putin, perhaps China as well, for coming up with a peace plan whose clauses the West finds unacceptable. The Western allies will make it a point to use the G7 podium to tell the world that aggression will not be accepted and cannot be rewarded. These G7 leaders will be joined by the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Of course, we discussed our cooperation within the framework of Japan being chair of the G7. Prime Minister Kishida invited me today to take part in the G7 summit that is planned for May in Hiroshima. I accepted the invitation to take part virtually.
So if you thought what happened in Moscow was a defining moment in the war, Kishida's visit to Kiev set in motion a trailer for the next big event in what's becoming a never-ending Ukraine war. And here's a question. Who is responsible for the safety of diplomatic missions abroad? Who is responsible for ensuring that these missions are not threatened? Well, if we go by the Vienna Convention, it is the responsibility of the state these missions are based in. On your screen, in fact, is a copy of this convention. Let me quote what it says. It says the Vienna Conventions on the Protection of Diplomatic Facilities state that all states have a responsibility to use every means to protect the consular properties within their territories. All violations of those conventions must be investigated and prosecuted by the states. And why am I telling you all of this? Because one country has failed to live up to this pledge. The United Kingdom. Just look at what happened on Sunday. A group of Khalistan sympathizers entered the Indian High Commission in London and tried to replace the Indian flag with their own. How did such a thing happen? What was the security doing? How could such elements even enter a diplomatic office? These are questions New Delhi is asking the British government. But upon failure to find a clear answer, it has been forced to take a major step, a tit-for-tat move. Have a look at these images. India has started to reduce security outside the British High Commission, also outside the residence of its envoy, Alex Ellis. Reports say barricades outside the UK mission and the High Commissioner's residence have been removed. However, there has been no reduction in security personnel posted at the mission. This, by and large, is a retaliatory move, a move aimed at making the UK understand its failure in protecting the Indian mission. The question is, has the message reached London? Well, it has. Within hours of the move, the Indian mission in London was placed under heavy security. Reports say the Metropolitan Police deployed more than 20 buses in front of the mission. It also deployed mounted troops to patrol the nearby streets. Did it really have to be this way? How did things reach this point? Like I said, the answer is the UK's failure to safeguard the premises of the Indian mission in London. In recent years, we've seen several violent demonstrations by Khalistanis outside the Indian Commission. They come, they raise anti-India slogans, they wave their flags and indulge in vandalism as the British authorities watch in silence. This time, India says it has had enough. If the UK cannot ensure the security of the Indian mission, why should India? This is the argument. The question is, what could come next? Could these tit-for-tat moves result in downgrading of the ties? Could they affect the many bilateral deals between the two countries? Especially the free trade deal. There are voices who want to freeze this deal. I know the demand is a bit far-fetched, but then again, in diplomacy, nothing is certain. For the unversed, this free trade agreement is, in a sense, a pact that aims to reduce customs tariff on substantial trade between the two countries. This agreement covers both trade in goods and trade in services. And this deal is a win-win for both sides. It will ensure smoother trade, not to mention boost business for certain products as well, especially Scotch and whiskey brands. You see, the UK is a competitive supplier of whiskey to India. It exported whiskey worth 110 million euros in 2019. But India imposes a 150% tariff on spirit imports. Once the FTA is finalized, this tariff could be reduced or even abolished. And this would open up the Indian market to many luxury brands. But last we checked, the developments in London, the attack on the Indian mission, cast its dark shadow on the FTA. Some are of the opinion that unless the UK guarantees the security of the Indian mission, this deal should not be taken forward. Until now, the authorities concerned have said no such thing. But if these attacks persist, if these episodes of vandalism persist, there is no saying to what extent will India be willing to go. Let me take you back in time. The year was 2016. Planes and drones hovered over the city of Mosul. Multiple airstrikes were carried out. They were targeted at the Islamic State militants of Iraq, but they ended up killing civilians. The dense streets of Mosul were filled with ordinary people. Some were prevented from leaving. Others were also frightened to cross the front lines and escape. Do you know who was behind this massacre? The United Kingdom. The UK military claimed to have fought a perfect war in Iraq, that British weapons did not harm a single civilian. But the survivors have a different story to tell. Have a look at this report by Guardian. It tells the stories of the victims that have surfaced now. One survivor lost her eldest daughter when a missile exploded near them. She had to have both her legs amputated. Our second daughter still has shrapnel in her skull. Her son, just a toddler at the time, lost parts of a foot and hand. Another woman lost her mother, father, 2 siblings and 2 nephews as a missile destroyed their home. What do the UK and the US have to say for themselves? The US-led coalition accepted civilian casualties from airstrikes, but it did not say which country fired the weapons. In total, across the 6 strikes identified as British attacks, the coalition accepts killing only 26 civilians. Isn't this what the West does? It treats third world countries as its playground. It stations its troops posing as saviors, butchers people left, right and center, and then never takes accountability for this. The atrocities began in 2003 on the 20th of March. The US and allied forces invaded Iraq. They toppled Saddam Hussein's regime. The US had claimed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that it was a threat to international peace. Most countries refused to support military action against it. They waited for the UN and International Energy Authority to find evidence. But the US refused to wait for the inspections. It assembled a coalition of the willing against Iraq. Of the 30 countries in the coalition, the UK, Australia and Poland participated in the invasion. It was a war built on lies, on imagination instead of facts. It was driven by fear and not hard intelligence, and it was waged by 2 men, George Bush and Tony Blair. Before ordering the invasion, Bush said that he could not wait for the final proof. Tony Blair said it was beyond doubt that Saddam Hussein was producing weapons of mass destruction. He dismissed anti-war demonstrations, saying history would be his judge. And yet, Iraq had no nuclear program, no poison gases, no shells filled with deadly viruses. UN inspectors had scoured the country for months. But what was it all about? The UK began bombing Iraq again in 2014. It targeted IS fighters. Strikes in Syria began a year later. Between 2014 and 2020, it dropped over 4,000 munitions in the 2 countries. The British military claims those strikes killed over 3,000 militants in Syria. Over 1,000 militants were killed and only 1 civilian died. The US-led coalition killed 1,437 civilians during that period. How is it possible that the UK killed only 1 of them? And why does it continue to lie? This month, we mark the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, a war that cost nearly $3 trillion, that took nearly 584,000 lives. And these figures are only for direct deaths. Many more died due to diseases, displacement, and starvation. The UK and the US have moved on, but Iraq is still in shambles. Have a look at this video.
Elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean, of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway. 75.
Did you hear that? George Bush accidentally said Iraq instead of Ukraine, and the audience laughed. He made a joke out of his slip up. Some called it a Freudian slip. He blamed it on his age. This is how trivial the Iraq war has become for the Americans, for the man who gave the orders for the invasion himself. But in Iraq, people still struggle with the trauma of that war. Listen to this now.
In the beginning, they said, oh, it's about removing this threat to world and weapons of mass destruction. And then they didn't find any and couldn't even manufacture. So then they shifted and said, oh, it's about democracy. But if you go now and ask Iraqis, do we have a democracy in Iraq? No. We have an oligarchy. We have one of the most corrupt systems in the world.
The UK and the US launched an illegal war of aggression. They committed war crimes. Today they cry sanctions against Russia. But what about what they did in Iraq? 20 years on, the leaders have never faced criminal charges. The US troops are still stationed in Iraq. When will the West be held accountable? The Wuhan virus pandemic has subsided. Normalcy has returned. The masks are off. But the threat is not over. I'm talking about the Marburg virus. It's making its presence felt in Tanzania, with the government issuing high alerts, flights getting cancelled, and quarantine zones in the making. What is the story of this virus? What is the situation looking like at this point? Our next report getting you all the details.
The Marburg virus has an 88% fatality rate. The deadly Ebola-like virus has now attacked Tanzania. It has already claimed 5 lives in the country. Tanzania has fired up its health security measures and confirmed the outbreak of the virus. Kenya is on high alert. Health officials are on their toes to ensure all travelers are screened before entering the country. But Kenya is not the first one to restrict travelers. Canada has also restricted travel to specific regions in Africa, especially Equatorial Guinea, which is also witnessing an outbreak of the infectious virus. The Central African country has placed over 200 people in quarantine and restricted movement in parts of the nation. The Marburg virus originates from bats, fruit bats to be specific. It causes severe headache, high fever, and gradually gives the host a feeling of being unwell. The virus spreads through human-to-human transmission. The virus has an incubation period of 21 days, which means a person may not even know that they have caught the infection until multiple days have gone by. There are no vaccines or antiviral treatments approved for the Marburg virus. The WHO has given a glimmer of hope. It says that rehydration and treatment of specific symptoms can improve a person's chances of survival. Experts say the lack of treatment is due to the small number of cases in the world. But can we afford to remain complacent? Health experts say this virus could be deadlier than the COVID-19 virus. The symptoms include more than just fever. The infected individual witnesses bleeding in different parts of the body, which can also result in liver failure. The WHO has found out that Marburg lies in the same family as Ebola. The Marburg virus is not something nations should be taking lightly. Realizing this, the WHO has launched an in-depth investigation. National teams have been deployed to the affected areas for providing medical care, and scientists are trying to formulate a vaccine. Is this the beginning of another pandemic, or will nations and international organizations act faster this time to save people from one of the deadliest viruses in the world?
Our next story comes from Somalia, where people are dying of hunger. While the rest of the media focuses on other issues, we want to put the spotlight on what the Somalians are going through at this point. Let's give you a basic reality check. The East African country is witnessing severe drought and a major famine crisis. Experts say that over 34,000 will die due to hunger in the first 6 months of this year. The number of fatalities has always been on the rise. Somalia suffered the death of 43,000 people last year as it went through the 6th consecutive failed rainy season. The worst part is that more children died as compared to adults, most of them under the age of 5. More than 213,000 people are at high risk of famine, and over 7.8 million people, which is half of the population, is now affected by the drought. This news of famines and droughts affecting Somalia is nothing new. The country has been witnessing the crises since 1992, when more than 300,000 people lost their lives. This has been the trend for more than 2 decades now. But this is where a major question comes up. Why have countries ignored the history of famines and droughts in Somalia? You see, politics is a major reason. Nations have always been worried to send aid to Somalia as it was believed to be controlled by terror groups. The governments were concerned about what if the medical aid falls in the hands of terrorists. This contributed to the significant decline in aid to the country. While Western donors continue to prioritize geopolitical relations over the urgent need to avoid famine, Al-Shabaab, the terror group dominating the country, paid little heed to the crisis there. They restricted humanitarian access and rejected emergency aid. And now the UN says that a large number of people have been pushed into reliance on humanitarian assistance. But is humanitarian assistance the solution? Somali officials say that such assistance can only be a stopgap measure when crises occur. Dependence on food aid can be a brutal cycle where a country will become dependent on other countries for aid every time a crisis occurs. And the other major problem with humanitarian aid is that once funds are earmarked for a certain purpose, it cannot be used for any other requirement, even if it's connected to the current crisis. So what can be the solution for Somalia? Officials say resilience schemes can be the answer, in which organizations can help build projects like water reservoirs, irrigation, fodder, create alternative clean energy sources like solar energy. The tragedy in Somalia is more saddening as people are suffering from a climate-related crisis, a country which hardly contributes to the global emissions. The country is in need of a green energy transition that would allow it to adapt to the changing climate reality. Breakups hurt, don't they? It takes time to move on from someone you loved. It can get to the best of us. In that fragile time, many of us end up making mistakes, messing up good opportunities. The hurt can be especially unbearable for teenagers of age groups who are just learning to foster relationships outside of their families. After a breakup, youngsters often feel lost, directionless. Some discuss their woes with their peers. Some talk to their therapists, but not everyone has a healthy outlet. And that is what the government of New Zealand is trying to change. It has launched a campaign to deal with breakups and heartbreaks. It's called Love Better, and it is for people of all age groups. Have a look at this advertisement.
So, I'm doing it. I'm officially deleting my ex from all my socials. I'm moving on.
A young woman shares her experience of removing her ex from her social media. She says that she is moving on. And here's another one.
I'm going to have to do it, honestly. This is getting ridiculous. This is getting so out of hand. I need to sleep at night. I need to get over her, get over this hurdle. Just delete it. Unblock. No, not unblock, block.
Another young man is working up to block their ex. Get over this hurdle, just delete it, he says. These videos were released as a part of the Love Better campaign. They feature actual people who have just suffered a heartbreak. You can see them trying to move on. These snippets were released on social media platforms, famous among the youth. Why? To help the youngsters cope with emotional distress. Not through scripted videos, not through motivational lectures by life coaches, but by real people. Through raw and unfiltered stories of those who are in the same boat as them. This is a one-of-a-kind campaign launched by the New Zealand's Ministry of Social Development. It aims to help people foster safe, positive and equal relationships. Nearly 80% of 16 to 24-year-olds in New Zealand have been in a relationship. 87% of them experienced harm beyond the normal hurt of breaking up. Most of the hurt reported was emotional, but 1 in 6 young people faced physical arguments in their relationships. And this not only puts the youth at risk, but it can also hamper the way they look at relationships or form connections later in their lives. You see, breakups come with a lot of consequences, and this includes self-harm, depression, substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, violence, blackmailing, stalking. Most of the time, guardians have no clue what their kids are going through. Adolescents are left in an abyss. If they don't receive proper guidance, a failed relationship can drive them to extremes. Simply asking them to get over it or find some distraction is not enough. How many times have you heard the same piece of advice? Does it ever really work? Instead of getting over it, the Love Better campaign asks those with a broken heart to own their emotions. It affirms that feeling hurt is a normal part of being human. The campaign supports young people to acknowledge their pain, to channel it into something positive for themselves. And this includes normalizing asking for help when needed. And this, by the way, is just the first phase of this campaign. The coming phases will depend on the findings of this one, and the Love Better campaign will cost around $4 million over the next 3 years. You see, the New Zealand government is willing to spend this kind of money for its heartbroken youth. The question is, will other countries follow suit? And as I end the show tonight, I want to talk about a particular word. In fact, it's no ordinary word. It is known as the most overused word. So there is a high chance that you have already heard of it. The word is vibe. And if in case you haven't heard of it, here's a quick crash course. In the earlier times, if you mentioned the word vibe, it was probably to refer to a vibraphone, the percussion instrument. And from then to now, the word has come a long way. It has made its presence felt in more ways than one. It has made its way to headlines. It has been used to describe the economic downturn as well. It is increasingly used to describe the mood of the area that you're in as well. Even Google swears by it. This piece about its maps feature mentions how you can get a quote-unquote vibe check about a particular area. Basically, there is no escaping this word. It's all around us. It can be used to describe the atmosphere of a place, the weather, the mood, the energy of an area, even an outfit. So the word dons many hats, and to put it simply, it could mean vibrations. Do you just sense it when the energy of a place is not quite right, or you don't get the energy that you want from a particular person? Basically, something just feels off. So what's the vibe check then? Well, the vibe is off. And that brings me to my next point, that this obsession with intangible vibrations is as old as time. You have probably heard of the Chinese concept of qi, or the life force of living things. There is also something called negative qi. It is similar to what we call bad vibes. Ancient Greek philosopher scientists had come up with the idea of a so-called fifth element that made the world work, the auras, the fields of energy around people. You know what I mean. But I do want to wrap this show by sending you good vibes, a lot of good energy. Since it is the most overused word already, no harm in using it one more time. On that note, it's a wrap on this edition of Gravitas Tonight. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching.